My name is Dr. Amara Okafor, and for 12 years, I was the woman no one wanted to hear. I was the scientist whose warnings were dismissed, whose research was buried, whose voice was silenced by those who found my truths inconvenient. But on September 15, 2023, I stood before the United Nations General Assembly and received a 5-minute standing ovation that changed everything. This is the story of how I went from being ignored to being heard by the world. It began in 2011. When I was a 28-year-old environmental scientist working for the Nigerian Ministry of Environment. I had just completed my PhD in environmental chemistry from Oxford University, and I was passionate about using my education to help my home country address its environmental challenges. Nigeria was facing serious pollution problems from oil extraction, industrial waste, and rapid urbanization, and I believed science could provide solutions. My first assignment was to conduct a comprehensive study of water quality in the Niger Delta region. What I found there would haunt me for the next 12 years and ultimately change the course of my life. The Niger Delta, home to Nigeria's oil industry, was an environmental disaster. Decades of oil spills, gas flaring, and industrial pollution had contaminated the water supply for over 30 million people. But what I discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. In village after village, I found water sources contaminated with levels of heavy metals, petroleum byproducts, and industrial chemicals that were hundreds of times higher than international safety standards. Children were drinking water that contained lead levels that would be considered toxic waste in developed countries. Pregnant women were consuming mercury at concentrations that guaranteed birth defects, but the most shocking discovery came when I analyzed the health records from local clinics. Cancer rates in the Niger Delta were 400% higher than the national average. Birth defects occurred at rates comparable to areas affected by nuclear disasters. Life expectancy was 15 years lower than in other parts of Nigeria. I documented everything meticulously. I took thousands of water samples, conducted extensive health surveys, and compiled photographic evidence of the environmental destruction. My report was 847 pages of irrefutable scientific evidence that the Niger Delta was experiencing an environmental catastrophe that was killing its people. I submitted my report to the Ministry of Environment in March 2012, confident that such overwhelming evidence would prompt immediate action. I was naive. Dr. Adebayo Fashola, my supervisor at the ministry, called me into his office 2 weeks after I submitted the report. "Amara," he said, not looking up from his desk, "your report is very thorough." "Thank you, sir. I believe the evidence clearly shows we need immediate intervention to address the water contamination crisis." "Yes, well, the problem is that your findings are quite alarming. Perhaps too alarming." I didn't understand. "Sir, the contamination levels are factual. The health impacts are documented. This is a public health emergency." Dr. Fashola finally looked at me, his expression stern. "Amara, you're young, and you're idealistic. But you need to understand that environmental reports like this have implications. Economic implications. Political implications." "What do you mean?" "The oil industry employs hundreds of thousands of Nigerians. It generates 90% of our export revenue. A report like this could damage investor confidence, affect international partnerships, and harm our economy." "But people are dying, sir. Children are being born with severe birth defects. Entire communities are being poisoned." "That may be true, but we need to consider the bigger picture. I'm recommending that your report be classified as preliminary. Findings requiring further study." "Further study?" "Sir, I spent 18 months collecting this data. The evidence is conclusive. The decision has been made, Amara. Your report will not be published or distributed. You're to begin a new project studying urban air quality in Lagos." I left that meeting in shock. My comprehensive documentation of an environmental catastrophe that was killing thousands of people was being buried because it was inconvenient for the oil industry and the government officials who profited from it, but I couldn't let it go. Over the next few months, I tried everything I could think of to get my findings heard. I reached out to environmental organizations, international NGOs, and academic institutions. I submitted papers to scientific journals, contacted journalists, and even tried to arrange meetings with government officials outside the Ministry of Environment. The response was always the same: polite interest followed by silence. Environmental organizations said they needed more funding to investigate. Journalists said they needed official confirmation from government sources. Academic journals said my research needed peer review from Nigerian institutions, the same institutions that were suppressing my work. I realized I was trapped in a system designed to silence inconvenient truths. In 2013, I made a decision that would define the next decade of my life. I would continue my research independently. documenting the environmental crisis in the Niger Delta on my own time and with my own resources. I used my vacation days and weekends to return to the Delta region. I spent my own money on water testing equipment and laboratory analysis. I built relationships with community leaders, traditional healers, and local activists who helped me access remote areas and collect data. The situation was getting worse. New oil spills were occurring regularly, but they weren't being reported in the media. Industrial facilities were dumping waste directly into rivers with no oversight. Gas flaring was increasing, filling the air with toxic compounds that were causing respiratory diseases in children. I documented everything. I created detailed maps showing contamination patterns. I tracked health outcomes over time. I interviewed hundreds of residents who described how their communities had changed as pollution increased. By 2015, I had compiled evidence of what I believed was one of the worst ongoing environmental disasters in the world. But I still couldn't get anyone to listen. That's when I met Dr. James Morrison, a British environmental lawyer who was visiting Nigeria as part of an international fact-finding mission. Dr. Morrison was investigating environmental crimes for the International Criminal Court, and someone had given him my name as a local expert. We met at a small cafe in Abuja, and I shared my research with him. Dr. Morrison spent 3 hours reviewing my data, asking detailed questions, and examining my photographic evidence. Dr. Okafor, he said finally, this is extraordinary work. The documentation is meticulous, the scientific methodology is sound, and the implications are staggering. Why hasn't this been published? I explained how my report had been suppressed, how I'd been reassigned to other projects, and how I'd been conducting this research independently for 3 years. This needs to be seen by the international community, Dr. Morrison said. Would you be willing to present your findings to the International Criminal Court? Would they listen? With evidence like this? Absolutely. What you've documented could constitute environmental crimes against humanity. For the first time in 4 years, I felt hope. Someone with credibility and international connections believed my work was important. Dr. Morrison helped me prepare a presentation for the International Criminal Court. We spent weeks organizing my data, creating visual presentations, and preparing legal arguments. In November 2015, I traveled to The Hague to present my findings to ICC investigators. The presentation went well. The investigators were clearly shocked by the scope of the environmental destruction I'd documented. They asked detailed questions, requested copies of all my data, and promised to investigate further, but months passed with no action. I followed up repeatedly, but the ICC investigators said they were still reviewing the evidence and consulting with relevant authorities. I later learned that the Nigerian government had lobbied extensively against ICC involvement, arguing that environmental issues were domestic matters that should be handled by national authorities. The same authorities who had buried my original report. By 2016, I was becoming desperate. I'd spent 5 years documenting an environmental catastrophe, and thousands of people were continuing to suffer while I struggled to get anyone to take action. That's when I decided to take my case directly to the people. I started a blog called Voices from the Delta, where I published my research findings, photographs, and interviews with affected communities. I used social media to share stories of families whose lives had been destroyed by environmental pollution. I created infographics showing contamination levels and health impacts. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Environmental activists around the world began sharing my content. International media outlets started reaching out for interviews. Academic institutions invited me to speak at conferences, but the Nigerian government was not pleased. In 2017, I was called into a meeting with officials from the Ministry of Environment, the Department of State Services, and the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation *. Dr. Okafor, said Director Amara Okafor from the DSS, your recent activities have come to our attention. Your blog and social media posts are spreading false information that damages Nigeria's reputation internationally. The information isn't false. It's based on scientific research and documented evidence. That's a matter of interpretation. We're here to inform you that your activities constitute a threat to national security. If you continue publishing unverified claims about environmental conditions, you could face charges under the Cybercrime Act. Are you threatening me for doing scientific research? We're advising you to be more careful about the information you share publicly. Nigeria's economic interests must be protected. I left that meeting knowing that I was now considered an enemy of the state for trying to protect public health and the environment, but I also knew I couldn't stop. Too many people were depending on someone to tell their story, to document their suffering, to demand justice for the environmental crimes being committed against them. Over the next 6 years, I continued my work despite increasing pressure from the government. My blog gained international attention, and I was invited to speak at environmental conferences around the world. I testified before parliamentary committees in the UK and European Union. I provided evidence to international human rights organizations, but in Nigeria, I remained a pariah. I was passed over for promotions, excluded from important projects, and subjected to constant surveillance. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves from me, afraid that association with my work would damage their own careers. I felt like a voice crying in the wilderness, warning of a disaster that everyone could see but no one wanted to acknowledge. Then, in early 2023, everything changed. The United Nations announced that they were convening a special session on environmental crimes and their impact on human rights. They were looking for expert witnesses who could provide first-hand testimony about environmental disasters that had been ignored or covered up by national governments. Dr. Morrison, who had remained a supporter of my work over the years, recommended me to the UN committee. In July 2023, I received an invitation to address the UN General Assembly about my research in the Niger Delta. I couldn't believe it. After 12 years of being ignored, dismissed, and threatened, the United Nations wanted to hear what I had to say. As I prepared for my presentation, I thought about all the people whose stories I would finally be able to tell on the world's biggest stage. The mothers who had lost children to preventable diseases. The fishermen whose livelihoods had been destroyed by oil spills. The farmers whose crops had been poisoned by industrial waste. For 12 years, their voices had been silenced. But on September 15, 2023, the world would finally hear them. Standing in the corridor outside the UN General Assembly Hall on September 15, 2023, I felt the weight of 12 years of struggle pressing down on my shoulders. In my hands, I held a folder containing 847 pages of evidence that had been dismissed, buried, and ignored by those in power. Today, that evidence would finally see the light it deserved. The invitation to address the UN had come with just 6 weeks' notice, but I had been preparing for this moment my entire career. Every water sample I'd collected in remote delta villages, every photograph of oil-contaminated farmland, every interview with grieving mothers, it had all led to this. Dr. Okafor? A young UN staffer approached me. "They're ready for you now." As I walked into the General Assembly Hall, I was struck by the magnitude of the moment. Representatives from 193 countries sat before me, along with journalists, activists, and observers from around the world. This was the largest audience I'd ever addressed, and certainly the most important. I had been allocated 20 minutes to present my findings, 20 minutes to summarize 12 years of research and advocacy. I had rehearsed my presentation dozens of times, but standing at that podium, looking out at the sea of faces, I felt the full responsibility of representing the voiceless. "Honorable delegates," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "My name is Dr. Amara Okafor, and I come before you today not just as a scientist, but as a witness to one of the world's most devastating and ignored environmental catastrophes." I clicked to my first slide, showing a map of the Niger Delta region. For the past 12 years, I have documented the systematic poisoning of 30 million people in Nigeria's Niger Delta. What I will show you today represents not just environmental destruction, but environmental crimes against humanity that have been covered up by those who profit from them. The room was completely silent. I could see delegates leaning forward, paying close attention to every word. I showed them photographs of children playing in water contaminated with oil. I presented data showing cancer rates that were 4 times the national average. I displayed charts documenting birth defect rates that rivaled those found in areas affected by nuclear disasters. These are not natural disasters, I emphasized. These are the direct result of decades of environmental negligence, regulatory capture, and the prioritization of corporate profits over human lives. As I continued my presentation, I noticed something remarkable happening in the audience. Delegates were taking notes furiously. Some were visibly emotional as I showed photographs of sick children and devastated communities. Others were whispering urgently to their staff members. I told them about my original report in 2012 and how it had been buried by the Nigerian government. I explained how I had been threatened, marginalized, and silenced for trying to protect public health. I described the years of independent research I had conducted while being treated as an enemy of the state. For 12 years, I said, I have been told that my research was too alarming, too damaging to economic interests, too inconvenient for political leaders. But the truth is never too inconvenient when human lives are at stake. I presented my most recent findings, showing that the situation in the Niger Delta had continued to deteriorate. New oil spills were occurring monthly. Industrial pollution was increasing. Health outcomes were getting worse, not better. The people of the Niger Delta are not asking for charity, I continued. They are asking for justice. They are asking for the basic human right to clean water, clean air, and a healthy environment for their children. As I neared the end of my presentation, I made the case for international intervention. I argued that when national governments fail to protect their citizens from environmental crimes, the international community has a responsibility to act. The evidence I have presented today has been available for over a decade, I said. The question is not whether these crimes are occurring, the question is whether the international community will continue to ignore them. I concluded by sharing a message from Chief Patience Ogbonna, an elderly woman from Ogoniland whose entire family had been affected by oil pollution. Chief Ogbonna told me, "Tell them that we are not asking them to feel sorry for us. We are asking them to help us get justice. Our children deserve the same right to a healthy life as children everywhere else in the world." As I finished speaking, the hall was completely silent for several seconds. Then, slowly, the delegate from Norway began to clap. Others joined in, and within moments, the entire General Assembly was on their feet, applauding. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes and 17 seconds, I know because journalists timed it. But more importantly, I could see in the faces of the delegates that my message had been heard and understood. After my presentation, I was surrounded by delegates, journalists, and activists. The response was overwhelming and immediate. The European Union representative announced that they would be launching an investigation into environmental crimes in the Niger Delta. The African Union committed to establishing a new environmental protection framework. Several countries pledged funding for cleanup efforts and health programs in affected communities, but the most significant response came from the UN Secretary-General himself. In an impromptu press conference, he announced that the United Nations would be establishing a new special rapporteur position on environmental crimes, with a mandate to investigate and report on environmental disasters that national governments had failed to address. Dr. Okafor's presentation today has opened our eyes to a crisis that has been hidden for too long, the Secretary-General said. The international community cannot stand by while environmental crimes are committed against vulnerable populations. The media response was immediate and global. Within hours, my presentation was being broadcast on news networks around the world. Social media exploded with support for the people of the Niger Delta and calls for action against environmental crimes. #JusticeForNigerDelta began trending worldwide. Environmental organizations that had previously ignored my work were suddenly eager to partner with me. Academic institutions that had rejected my research papers were now inviting me to publish in their journals, but the most meaningful response came from the Niger Delta itself. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens reached out to thank me for finally giving them a voice on the world stage. Chief Ogbonna, the elderly woman whose message I had shared with the UN, called me from her village. "Dr. Amara," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "for the first time in my life, I feel like the world is listening to us. You have given us hope." However, not everyone was pleased with my UN presentation. The Nigerian government's response was swift and harsh. Within 48 hours of my address to the UN, the Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement condemning my presentation as a deliberate attempt to damage Nigeria's international reputation through the spread of exaggerated and unverified claims. The statement accused me of being an agent of foreign interests seeking to undermine Nigeria's sovereignty and economic development. It claimed that my research was biased, unscientific, and designed to serve the agenda of international organizations that want to control Nigeria's natural resources. More concerning was a statement from the Nigerian Attorney General's office announcing that they were reviewing my activities for possible violations of the Cybercrime Act, the Official Secrets Act, and laws against economic sabotage. I knew that returning to Nigeria would likely mean arrest and prosecution. I had become a fugitive from my own country for the crime of telling the truth about environmental destruction, but I also knew that my work was far from over. The international attention generated by my UN presentation had created an opportunity to finally address the environmental crisis in the Niger Delta, but it would require sustained effort and continued advocacy. In the weeks following my presentation, I was invited to testify before parliamentary committees in multiple countries. I met with officials from the International Criminal Court, who announced that they were reopening their investigation into environmental crimes in Nigeria based on my evidence. The World Bank announced a $500 million fund for environmental remediation in the Niger Delta. The United Nations Environment Programme committed to establishing a permanent monitoring station in the region. Several international oil companies agreed to fund health programs for affected communities. Most importantly, the people of the Niger Delta were no longer voiceless. International media outlets were sending reporters to document the environmental destruction I had been describing for years. Human rights organizations were establishing permanent presences in affected communities. Environmental lawyers were filing lawsuits on behalf of poison villages. 3 months after my UN presentation, I received a call from Dr. Morrison, the environmental lawyer who had first encouraged me to take my case to international forums. "Amara," he said, "I have some news that I think you'll want to hear. The International Criminal Court has just announced that they're opening a formal investigation into environmental crimes in the Niger Delta. They're treating it as a crime against humanity case." What does that mean? It means that the people responsible for the environmental destruction you've documented could face international prosecution. It means that your 12 years of work have finally resulted in the possibility of real justice. I sat in my hotel room in New York, where I had been staying since my UN presentation, and felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication. Because the truth I had been trying to tell for 12 years was finally being heard and acted upon. Sadness because it had taken so long, and so many people had suffered while the world ignored their plight, but mostly, I felt hope. Hope that the children of the Niger Delta might grow up in a cleaner, healthier environment. Hope that the international community would no longer ignore environmental crimes committed against vulnerable populations. Hope that other scientists and activists who were being silenced for inconvenient truths would find the courage to keep speaking out. The woman who had been ignored for 12 years had finally been heard. But more importantly, the voices of 30 million people who had been silenced by environmental injustice were now being amplified by the international community. The standing ovation at the United Nations had lasted 5 minutes. But the impact of that moment would last for generations. 6 months after my address to the United Nations, I stood once again before an international audience, but this time the setting was very different. I was in the courtroom of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, serving as the lead witness in the first-ever prosecution for environmental crimes against humanity. The defendants were not just the oil company executives and government officials who had directly caused the environmental destruction in the Niger Delta. They were also the people who had systematically silenced those of us who tried to expose the truth. The prosecutors argued that the cover-up was as much a crime as the original environmental destruction. Dr. Okafor, said Prosecutor Sarah Chen, "Can you tell the court about the systematic efforts to suppress your research and silence your voice?" I looked across the courtroom at the defendants, former Nigerian government ministers, oil company executives, and regulatory officials who had spent years denying the environmental catastrophe I had documented. Some of them were the same people who had threatened me, marginalized me, and tried to destroy my career for telling the truth. For 12 years, I testified, there was a coordinated effort to ensure that the world never learned about the environmental crimes being committed in the Niger Delta. This wasn't just negligence or incompetence, it was a deliberate strategy to prioritize profits over human lives. I detailed how my original 2012 report had been buried, how I had been threatened with prosecution for my blog posts, and how government officials had actively worked to discredit my research and prevent international organizations from investigating. The defendants didn't just commit environmental crimes, I continued. They committed crimes against truth itself. They silenced scientists, intimidated journalists, and lied to the international community about the scope of the environmental destruction they were causing. The trial had been made possible by the international attention generated by my UN presentation. Within weeks of my address to the General Assembly, multiple countries had referred the Niger Delta case to the ICC. The UN Security Council had authorized the investigation, and prosecutors had been given unprecedented access to evidence and witnesses, but the road to this courtroom had not been easy. The Nigerian government had initially refused to cooperate with the ICC investigation, claiming that it violated national sovereignty. Several of the defendants had fled to countries without extradition treaties. Oil companies had spent millions on legal teams and public relations firms to fight the charges. However, the evidence was overwhelming. My 12 years of documentation had provided prosecutors with a detailed record of environmental crimes and cover-ups. International media attention had encouraged other scientists and activists to come forward with their own evidence of suppression and intimidation. Most importantly, the people of the Niger Delta had finally found their voice. Hundreds of community members had traveled to The Hague to testify about how environmental pollution had destroyed their lives and how government officials had ignored their pleas for help. Chief Patience Ogbonna, the elderly woman whose message I had shared with the UN, was one of the most powerful witnesses. Now 73 years old and suffering from cancer that doctors linked to environmental pollution, she spoke directly to the defendants. "You knew what you were doing to us," she said, her voice strong despite her frail appearance. "You knew that your oil spills were poisoning our water. You knew that your gas flaring was making our children sick. And you knew that people like Dr. Amara were telling the truth about what you were doing to us. But you chose money over our lives. You chose to silence the truth instead of fixing the problems. You treated us like we didn't matter, like our children's lives were worth less than your profits. The courtroom was silent as Chief Ogbonna continued. Dr. Amara never gave up on us, even when her own government turned against her. She risked everything to tell our story. She is the reason the world finally knows what you did to us. The trial lasted 8 months and featured testimony from over 200 witnesses. Environmental scientists from around the world testified about the scope of the contamination. Health experts documented the medical impacts on affected communities. Former government officials and oil company employees testified about the deliberate efforts to suppress information and silence critics. The evidence painted a picture of systematic environmental destruction accompanied by an equally systematic campaign to hide the truth from the international community. During the trial, I learned details about the suppression campaign that I hadn't known before. Internal documents revealed that oil companies had spent over $50 million on a coordinated effort to discredit environmental research and silence critics. Government officials had received payments from oil companies in exchange for burying reports and intimidating scientists. There had been a specific strategy to target me personally. Company documents showed that I had been identified as a high-priority threat because of the quality of my research and my international connections. They had lobbied government officials to have me fired, transferred, or prosecuted. Dr. Okafor represented everything they feared, Prosecutor Chen explained to the court. She was a credible scientist with irrefutable evidence, and she refused to be silenced. They knew that if her research became public, it would expose the full scope of their crimes. The defense arguments were predictable but disturbing. They claimed that environmental damage was an unavoidable consequence of economic development. They argued that oil extraction was essential for Nigeria's economy and that environmental concerns had to be balanced against economic needs. Most offensively, they argued that people like me were environmental extremists who exaggerated problems to advance a radical agenda against industrial development. Dr. Okafor and others like her represent a dangerous trend, argued defense attorney Marcus Webb. They use emotional appeals and selective data to demonize legitimate business activities that provide jobs and economic growth for developing countries. Listening to these arguments, I was reminded of why I had spent 12 years fighting to be heard. These were the same justifications that had been used to silence me, to bury my research, and to ignore the suffering of millions of people, but this time, the truth could not be suppressed. The evidence was too overwhelming, the international attention too intense, and the voices of the affected communities too powerful to ignore. On March 15, 2024, exactly 13 years after I had submitted my first report on Niger Delta contamination, the International Criminal Court delivered its verdict. All 12 defendants were found guilty of crimes against humanity related to environmental destruction and the systematic suppression of information about environmental crimes. The court ruled that the deliberate silencing of scientists and activists constituted a crime against humanity because it prevented the international community from responding to environmental disasters. The defendants did not just poison the environment, Judge Maria Santos read from the verdict. They poisoned the truth itself. They created a system designed to ensure that environmental crimes could be committed with impunity, hidden from international scrutiny by a campaign of intimidation, suppression, and misinformation. The sentences were significant. The former Nigerian environment minister received 15 years in prison. Oil company executives received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. Government officials who had participated in the cover-up received sentences of 5 to 10 years, but more importantly, the court ordered comprehensive remediation of the Niger Delta environment and established a $2 billion fund for healthcare and compensation for affected communities. The verdict made international headlines and established important legal precedents. For the first time, an international court had ruled that the systematic suppression of environmental information constituted a crime against humanity. The decision sent a clear message that environmental crimes and cover-ups would no longer be tolerated by the international community. After the verdict was announced, I was surrounded by journalists, activists, and supporters. But the moment that meant the most to me was when Chief Ogbonna approached me with tears in her eyes. "Dr. Amara," she said, embracing me, "you kept your promise. You made sure the world heard our voices. You made sure they could not ignore us anymore." That evening, I attended a celebration dinner with other environmental activists and ICC prosecutors. As I looked around the room at people who had supported my work and fought for justice, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 13 years earlier, I had been a young scientist who believed that good research and honest reporting would be enough to protect people from environmental harm. I had learned the hard way that truth alone is not enough when powerful interests are determined to suppress it, but I had also learned that truth, combined with persistence, courage, and international solidarity, can ultimately prevail over even the most determined efforts at suppression. The next morning, I received a call that would define the next chapter of my life. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres was personally inviting me to serve as the first special rapporteur on environmental crimes, the position that had been created in response to my presentation to the General Assembly. "Dr. Okafor," he said, "your work has shown the international community that environmental crimes and the suppression of environmental information pose threats to human rights and international peace. We need someone with your experience and credibility to lead our efforts to prevent future environmental crimes and protect those who speak out against them." I accepted the position, knowing that it would allow me to use my experience to help other environmental defenders around the world who were facing the same suppression and intimidation that I had endured. Today, as I write this from my office at the United Nations in New York, I think about the journey from that first buried report in 2012 to the standing ovation in 2023 to the criminal convictions in 2024. The Niger Delta is finally being cleaned up. The health programs funded by the ICC settlement are providing medical care to thousands of people who had been suffering in silence. New environmental monitoring systems are preventing future contamination. Most importantly, environmental defenders around the world know that they are not alone. The international community has established clear legal precedents that environmental crimes and the suppression of environmental information will not be tolerated. I still receive emails from scientists, activists, and community leaders who are fighting environmental crimes in their own countries. They tell me that my story has given them hope and courage to continue their work despite threats and intimidation. Dr. Okafor, wrote Dr. Maria Santos, an environmental scientist in Brazil who is documenting deforestation crimes in the Amazon. "Your example has shown us that even when our own governments try to silence us, the international community will eventually listen if we refuse to give up." That is the legacy I hope to leave, the knowledge that truth, no matter how inconvenient or threatening to powerful interests, will ultimately be heard if we have the courage to keep speaking it. The woman who was ignored for 12 years is now helping to ensure that other voices will not be silenced. The standing ovation at the United Nations was not the end of my story, it was the beginning of a new chapter in the global fight for environmental justice, and every day, I remember Chief Ogbonna's words, "You made sure they could not ignore us anymore." That is why I fought for 12 years to be heard. That is why I risked everything to tell the truth. And that is why I will continue to amplify the voices of those who are fighting for environmental justice around the world. The truth may be inconvenient, but it is never wrong. And in the end, it will always find a way to be heard. Warning: legal notice. This story is completely fictional and has been created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, actual events, or real institutions is purely coincidental. Asterisk.